Hey guys, tonight we're going to try and survive something absolutely awful. Picture yourself in rural Ireland, mid-1840s. The smell of damp earth, the constant mist clinging to everything, and the gnawing pit in your stomach that started weeks ago and just hasn't left. You're standing in what used to be a thriving potato field, but now it's just a field of black, slimy decay. The plants, the very foundation of your existence, are rotten mush. It's less a crisis and more an ongoing, slow-motion catastrophe unfolding right at your feet. Honestly, statistically speaking, you probably won't survive this particular historical nightmare, but hey, let's give it a boring, slow-paced shot, shall we? So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And if you feel like it, drop a comment with where you're winding down tonight and what time it is for you. Always cool to see where these sleepy survival adventures take us. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You're standing there, the chill seeping through your thin clothes, and the smell is truly something else, like death and decay mixed with damp soil. You've heard about the blight, seen it creeping from field to field, but seeing it claim your own tiny plot, it's like watching your future dissolve into black slime. Every day for generations, it's been the potato, the sturdy, reliable, astonishingly nutritious potato. It fed families, it paid the rent, or helped you grow enough to survive without needing to earn much cash rent. It was boiled for dinner, maybe mashed with a bit of milk if you were lucky, maybe just eaten plain. Breakfast, dinner, supper, sometimes all the same. Your muscles, your ability to work the land, your very survival hinged on that single crop. And now it's gone. It started subtly. A few brown spots on the leaves, then quickly turning black, the stems collapsing, and worst of all, when you dug them up, the tubers themselves were rotten inside or turned to pulp within days of being harvested. It wasn't just a bad year, it was a complete and utter failure across the entire country and beyond. The specific fungus responsible, Phytophthora infestans, arrived relatively suddenly, believed to have traveled from North America to Europe. It thrived in the cool, wet Irish climate, spreading with terrifying speed and efficiency. This wasn't just a local problem, it was continental. But nowhere was it as devastating as here, where such a huge portion of the population depended almost entirely on this one vulnerable crop. It's like your entire diet vanished overnight, except overnight is a kind term for the creeping horror of watching it happen field by field, knowing what it meant. The initial reaction wasn't panic, not exactly. More like disbelief, then a grim resignation. You and your neighbors talk in hushed tones, sharing equally bleak stories. "Mine are gone," someone mutters, shaking their head. Same here. It's a shared desolation. The small patch of oats or barley might offer a little something, maybe enough to stave off immediate starvation for a few weeks, but it's nowhere near enough to last through the winter. You don't have livestock to sell, maybe a pig, but that's usually for rent or a major purchase, not daily sustenance. You don't have savings. What little money might have come from selling eggs or butter is now worth less and less as food prices elsewhere skyrocket. This is a society teetering on the edge, and the potato blight just gave it a massive shove. So you start looking around. What else is there? The land is bare, the streams are running clear, but offer little sustenance beyond a rare fish or two if you have the means to catch them. You probably don't. Your eyes begin to drift, perhaps initially out of desperation, towards the gray line where the land meets the sea. You live inland, maybe not miles and miles, but far enough that the coast wasn't part of your daily life. It was for fishing villages, for trade perhaps, but not for you, the smallholder farmer. Now the coast beckons. It's a walk, a long, weary walk. You probably gather a few other desperate souls from your village or townland, people you've known your whole life, now gone and quiet, their faces etched with worry. The conversation isn't lively, it's sparse and practical. "Heard you can eat the stuff on the rocks," someone might offer hesitantly. "Seaweed, isn't it?" My grandmother used to talk about it, another might add, during the hungry times, but that was different. Not like this. Yeah, not like this. As you walk, the landscape changes. The soft, peat-rich earth gives way to rockier terrain. The smell of the sea, initially just a faint tang on the wind, grows stronger. It's a different world, and one you know little about. You've seen the ocean, of course, maybe visited a market town by the coast once or twice in your life. But living off it, that's an entirely alien concept. Historians still argue whether people in inland areas had any traditional knowledge of coastal foraging, or if this was a completely new, desperate experiment forced upon them by the blight. It feels new and intimidating to you. You reach the coast eventually. The air is colder here, sharper. The sound of the wind is a constant, rhythmic roar. The gray expanse of the Atlantic stretches out to the horizon, cold and indifferent. The rocks are slick with green and brown growth. It looks unappealing, honestly. Not exactly a feast for the eyes. But your stomach is empty, and the sight of potential food, however foreign and strange, holds a desperate kind of allure. You watch the tide, a slow, powerful inhale and exhale of the ocean. As it recedes, it leaves behind glistening stretches of rock and dark, clinging masses. This is it. This is what people talked about. Seaweed, your first real encounter with the raw, untamed larder of the sea. It doesn't look like the promise of survival, not like a field of healthy potatoes did. It looks like a last desperate resort. But hunger is a powerful motivator. And the alternative, staying inland with nothing, simply unthinkable. You have to try. You stand there feeling the spray on your face, a sharp contrast to the damp, heavy air you're used to inland. The rocks are tricky, covered in that slippery green growth that feels weird and unstable under your worn boots. You step carefully, your eyes scanning the dark, rubbery fronds exposed by the retreating tide. There's so much of it, clinging in tangled mats. Different kinds, too. Some are long and ribbon-like, dark brown or greenish. Others are bubbly or thick and leathery. It's overwhelming, like walking into a grocery store where everything is weird and smells of fish and salt. Which one do you even start with? Someone in your small group points to a thick brown type with a sort of ridged stem. That one, maybe, looks substantial. You tentatively reach down, the seaweed feeling cold and slick. Pulling it free requires a surprising amount of effort. It clings stubbornly to the rock like it's afraid of ending up in a soup pot, which, spoiler alert, it probably is. The smell is intense, definitely of the sea, but also decay, or maybe just unfamiliar salinity. You gather a handful, letting it drip onto the rocks. It feels heavy, dense. You learn quickly through trial and error, and maybe a few scraps of remembered lore, that not all seaweed is created equal. Some are too tough, too slimy, or just plain inedible. You focus on a few types that seem more promising. There's Laminaria digitata, commonly called oarweed or kombu in other parts of the world, with those long, flat fronds. Main femmes. Then there's Palmaria palmata, or dulce, often reddish and softer, which some people apparently even dried and chewed like tobacco or snacks, a quirky tidbit about its historical use. It has a slightly different, almost smoky flavor when dried, supposedly. And then there's Himanthelia elongata, thongweed, which looks like long, leathery straps. You grab handfuls, stuffing them into whatever makeshift bags or cloths you brought. It's bulky, heavy, and smells potent. Not exactly the scent of a Sunday roast, is it? More like low tide in a particularly enthusiastic bay. Dragging your haul back from the rocks, you find a somewhat sheltered spot, maybe a small cove or near the high tide line where a bit of a fire can be built. The goal now is to make this stuff food. Eating it raw is an option born purely of desperation. You try a tiny piece of the dulse. It's intensely salty, chewy, and leaves a vaguely fishy mineral taste in your mouth. Not great, definitely not a potato. Eating a large quantity raw seems like a recipe for a very upset stomach, or worse. So you try cooking. A small fire is coaxed to life, a precious commodity inland where full is scarce. But maybe there is driftwood here. You fill a pichumha, maybe a battered iron cauldron if you're lucky enough to have one, with seawater, and add the seaweed. Boiling seems the logical step. You watch as the water turns cloudy, the seaweed softening slightly. The smell intensifies, filling the air with a strong, briny aroma. It simmers for a long time. You stir it with a stick, observing the transformation, or lack thereof. After what feels like an age, you scoop some out. It's soft, yes, but still slimy, still seaweedy. You tentatively taste the broth. Salty, obviously, very salty. The seaweed itself is still chewy, though less tough than raw. It fills your stomach, a physical sensation of fullness, which is a relief in itself, even if the taste is borderline offensive. You try drying some of the dulse on warm rocks near the fire, hoping to improve its texture or make it storable. It shrinks and darkens, becoming brittle. Chewing on a dried piece is like eating salty, brittle plastic that tastes faintly of iodine. Delicious. 5 stars. Would starve again just for this experience. Despite the unappealing nature, this strange harvest holds potential. Seaweed, you are dimly aware through the gnawing hunger, does have some nutritional value. It's a source of various minerals, like iodine, perhaps too much of it in some types, potassium, and magnesium, which you probably weren't getting enough of anyway. More importantly, it contains some carbohydrates and even a little protein and fiber. While it can't replace the sheer caloric density of potatoes, especially for someone doing hard physical labor, it provides something among. It's a source of calories and essential nutrients that are simply not available anywhere else in your immediate, blighted environment. It's this quiet, boring nutritional fact that makes the hardship of gathering and preparing it worthwhile. Mainstream historical fact. Seaweed, particularly types like dulce and various laminaria species, provided vital calories and nutrients, including iodine, which helped prevent goiter, to coastal populations during times of famine. Gathering this resource is time-consuming and physically demanding. Clambering over wet, slippery rocks at low tide is dangerous. The tides themselves dictate your schedule, a relentless, non-negotiable clock. You have to be quick, gather what you can before the water returns, and then trek back to wherever you plan to process it. It's not a pleasant day out, it's a struggle against the elements and your own physical weakness. And you have to compete. Other desperate people from other inland areas are likely having the same grim idea, venturing to the coast. There's no polite queue for the best seaweed patches. Historians still argue whether the extensive turn to coastal foraging during the famine represented a continuation of limited, forgotten traditional practices in inland areas, or if it was almost entirely a spontaneous, desperate innovation driven by starvation. For you right now, it feels like the latter, a completely new world, a new set of rules, and a deeply unpleasant new diet. The abundance is deceptive. Extracting usable nutrition from it is the real challenge. It requires significant effort and ingenuity, qualities that are hard to muster when you're already weakened by hunger. But you persist. You have to. Because inland, there is nothing. So you have this bulky, dripping, smelly harvest. Now what? The process of turning it into something remotely edible is a whole other layer of tedious misery on top of the gathering. You drag the heavy sacks or bundles back to your temporary camp, perhaps a hollow in the dunes or a rocky overhang, trying to conserve what little energy you have. The smell of the sea follows you, clinging to your clothes, your hair, and seemingly soaking into the very air around you. It's the constant, unwelcome perfume of your new diet. The primary goal is to make it digestible and extract whatever sustenance it offers. Boiling is the most common method, requiring a fire. And fire, even here by the coast where driftwood might be more plentiful than inland peat, is still a resource you can't take for granted. You spend precious time scavenging for dry wood, coaxing flames to life, protecting them from the wind and dampness. The smoke stings your eyes, but the promise of a hot, if unappetizing meal is a powerful motivator. You fill your pot, maybe a rusty bucket repurposed, or if you're lucky, a proper iron cauldron salvaged from a deserted cottage or brought with you. Seawater goes in, then huge handfuls of the clean seaweed. It boils and boils. Hours seem to pass. The water becomes thick and dark. And the smell? Well, it doesn't improve. It just becomes stronger, more pervasive. Stirring the pot is a monotonous task. Watching the green and brown fronds soften, but never truly disintegrate or become appetizingly tender. It's less like cooking food and more like performing a prolonged act of chemical persuasion on stubborn marine vegetation. You skim off any foam or debris that rises to the surface, making the process feel slightly more civilized, though the end result quickly dispels that illusion. You try different types, hoping for variety or a hidden gem. Some are more mucilaginous, thickening the water into a sort of sludge. Others remain stubbornly chewy. You experiment with cooking times, thinking maybe longer is better, or maybe shorter preserves more nutrients, a concept you grasp only dimly, guided by instinct and desperation. Sometimes you try mashing it after boiling, creating a dark, lumpy paste that is even less appealing than the boiled strands. It sits heavy in your stomach, providing bulk, a temporary silencing of the hunger pangs, but little pleasure. Drying is another major undertaking. You spread thinner fronds like dulse or the ribbon-like laminaria out on sun-warmed rocks, or hang them on lines made from salvaged rope or knotted grass. The sun and wind do their work slowly. The seaweed shrinks dramatically, turning dark and brittle. This dried form is lighter and can be stored for longer, a crucial advantage when tides and weather are unpredictable. You chew on a piece of dried dulse. It's like eating incredibly salty, tough parchment. It scratches the inside of your mouth and leaves a lingering taste of minerals in the seafloor. But it is food. You can carry it with you, a dry, portable ration. The sheer quantity you need to gather and process is staggering. A small handful isn't enough. You need sacks, huge piles of it. You eat bowl after bowl of the boiled mess, trying to ignore the texture and the taste, focusing only on the feeling of fullness. It takes up so much physical space in your stomach, yet provides relatively few calories compared to the beloved potato. It's a constant uphill battle against malnutrition, fought with slimy, salty weapons. Finding enough fuel to cook these vast quantities is a daily challenge. Driftwood isn't infinite, and gathering it is often competitive. You might have to venture further along the coast, adding more walking and carrying to your already exhausted days. The wind often whips at your fires, making boiling a slow, frustrating process. Sometimes, when fuel is too scarce or you are too weak, you might eat a smaller portion of dried seaweed or even resort to eating a little raw, accepting the probable stomach upset as a consequence. One particular type of preparation you might encounter, perhaps learned from others or through desperate trial and error, involves Chondrus crispus, commonly known as Irish moss or carrageen moss. This smaller purplish-red seaweed isn't gathered for its bulk like the others, but for its gelling property. Boiled for a long time, sometimes with a bit of water or milk, if you are impossibly lucky to find any, it produces a thick, gelatinous liquid that sets into a wobbly, translucent jelly when cooled. This carrageenan jelly, sometimes lightly sweetened if a scrap of sugar could be found, an unimaginable luxury, was historically known as a famine food, providing a small amount of easily digestible carbohydrate and minerals. It was easier on the stomach than the tougher seaweeds and offered a different texture, a slight relief from the endless chewing of boiled or dried fronds. A quirky tidbit: while it provided some calories and was soothing, it wasn't a nutritional powerhouse on its own, often valued more for its perceived medicinal qualities or as a vehicle for scarce sugar or milk. Despite the drudgery and the unappealing nature of this diet, the seaweed provides essential nutrients. Mainstream historical fact: beyond calories and bulk, seaweed is a significant source of trace minerals, particularly iodine, which is crucial for thyroid function and preventing goiter, a condition likely exacerbated by a potato-heavy diet lacking in other minerals. While it doesn't provide everything you need, especially vitamin C, unless you find specific types or supplements, which you won't, it fills critical gaps left by the failure of the land crops. It contains some B vitamins, calcium, iron, and other minerals that are vital for staving off the worst effects of deficiency diseases, even if you are still constantly hungry and weak. Historians still argue whether the knowledge of processing and utilizing different types of seaweed was widely retained in coastal communities through generations, representing a survival fallback always understood, or if many of the specific techniques and uses had to be rediscovered or adapted on the fly during the famine years by people newly forced to rely on the sea. For you, it's a steep, unpleasant learning curve either way. Every day is a repetition of gathering, hauling, finding fuel, boiling, drying, and eating the same bland, salty, chewy stuff. It's boring, it's hard, and it's barely keeping you alive, but it's all there is. And as you endure this coastal existence, your mind turns inland to the hope of news, the hope of help, the hope of something, anything other than seaweed. You are waiting. The endless cycle of gathering, boiling, drying, and chewing seaweed becomes a dull ache, a constant, low-grade hum beneath the surface of your consciousness. It fills your days, occupies your hands, and provides just enough bulk to quiet the most violent gnawing of hunger. But it doesn't nourish your spirit. For that, you turn your thoughts inland, away from the relentless sea, towards a distant, shimmering hope. News, letters. In this desolate coastal existence, cut off from the world by the blight that has ravaged the land you fled, a letter isn't just a piece of paper. It's a lifeline, a connection to a life that feels increasingly distant, perhaps even mythical. It's the possibility of hearing from family who might have surveyed them elsewhere, or worse, confirming your worst fears. It's the chance, however slim, of learning about relief efforts, soup kitchens, potential emigration opportunities, or word from loved ones who have already left these shores, seeking a new beginning across the ocean. The thought of a letter from America, from Canada, from a brother or sister who managed to scrape together passage, that thought is a fragile, precious ember you guard fiercely against the winds of despair. Mainstream historical fact. Letters from emigrants who had found work abroad were often the most significant source of actual financial aid and hope for those left behind, containing remittances or promises of passage money, though sadly few families received them. The post office, then, isn't just a building. It's a pilgrimage site. It's the nexus where the crushing isolation of your present might intersect with the possibility of a future, or at least with knowledge of the past. It's not like mail magically appears where you are, hunkered down among the rocks. You have to go to it. This simple fact adds yet another layer of difficulty to your already impossible life. The nearest post office is in a village, miles inland, a journey that, in your weakened state, feels like traversing a continent. This journey isn't a casual stroll. It requires planning, energy you can barely spare, and dedicating an entire day, perhaps even longer, to the undertaking. You might try to save a small portion of dried seaweed, a hard, salty ration for the road. Every step inland, away from the reliable, albeit grim bounty of the sea, feels like a risk. What if you miss a good tide? What if the weather turns while you're bound? What if, despite the odds, a relief ship arrives and you're not there? These anxieties nip at the edges of your resolve. But the pull of hope, the yearning for news, is often stronger. It's the ultimate gamble in a life stripped down to nothing but gambles. Going inland is like voluntarily leaving your guaranteed terrible food source for a chance at something better, or at least knowing something better. You start thinking about the journey days in advance. It occupies your mind during the monotonous scraping of periwinkles from rocks, during the endless stirring of the boiling seaweed, during the long cold nights. You trace the potential route in your head, over the dunes, across the rough fields, perhaps along a muddy track or a deserted road. You think about the village, wondering if it's still standing, if the blight has been as cruel there as elsewhere. You picture the post office, a small, perhaps damp room, smelling of old paper and uncertainty, and the anticipation. It's a seesaw of emotion. One moment you allow yourself to imagine the impossible, a letter with good news, a message of survival, a promise of help. You picture yourself holding it, the weight of it in your trembling hand, the scratch of the ink on the paper. You might even crack a tiny, shaky smile at the thought. The next moment, the crushing weight of reality descends. What if there are no letters for anyone? What if the post office is closed? What if you make the arduous journey only to find nothing but disappointment, another empty day in a series of empty days? You quickly shove those thoughts away. Better to cling to the fragile hope, however improbable. It's better than the gray certainty of despair. There's also the practical consideration, a quirky tidbit that adds a layer of frustrating bureaucracy to your desperation. In those days, postage wasn't always prepaid. Sometimes, the recipient had to pay for the letter upon delivery. For people with literally nothing, the arrival of a letter from abroad could be a cruel irony, news you desperately needed but couldn't afford to receive. The postmaster might even open it to read out snippets of news before deciding if they'd extend credit or hold it. Imagine that, the postal worker being the gatekeeper to your hope and possibly charging you for the privilege. Yes, there's a letter from your sister in Boston. That'll be 6 pence, please. 6 pence. You could barely find 6 farthings. So the anticipation isn't just if there's a letter, but can you even access it if there is? It feels like a joke the universe is playing. A punchline that hits you squarely in the gut when you're already doubled over. Historians still argue whether the postal system, despite being operational, was truly accessible to the most destitute during the famine. Was the cost prohibitive? Were the distances too great for the weak? Was the infrastructure reliable enough to handle the surge of desperate communication? For you, trudging inland, the debate is academic. It's a distant building you hope to reach, where a potentially unaffordable piece of paper might or might not hold the key to, well, something other than seaweed. This journey is more than just physical exertion. It's a psychological test. It's clinging to a thread of possibility in a landscape defined by loss. It breaks the monotony of coastal survival, offering a brief, agonizing interlude of intense emotion. It represents your refusal to completely give up, your persistent, stubborn belief that the world beyond your rocky shore still exists, and that you might somehow reconnect with it. And so you prepare yourself, psyching yourself up for the miles ahead, fueled by the faintest glimmer of hope, and perhaps a carefully hoarded piece of dried dulse. The journey to the post office is about to begin. The first steps inland feel strange. You become so accustomed to the damp, salty air, the constant soundtrack of the waves, the feel of rough rock and shifting sand beneath your feet. Now, the ground is firmer, muddier in places, and the air is still, carrying the scent of damp earth and occasionally the faint, unsettling smell of something decaying. Each step is a deliberate effort. Your legs, weakened by constant hunger and exertion, protest with a dull ache that quickly escalates into a sharper throb. You try to maintain a steady pace, knowing that pushing too hard will exhaust you prematurely, but going too slow means the day will bleed into night before you reach the village. It's a delicate balance, a constant negotiation with your own failing body. The landscape changes subtly at first. The hardy, salt-tolerant grasses give way to tougher weeds, then patches of bare, brown earth. The signs of the blight are everywhere, even here. The fields you pass are empty. The lazy beds raised in happier times lie fallow and weed-choked. There are no signs of cultivation, no farmers working the land, no children playing in the distance. The silence is perhaps the most unnerving part, a heavy, oppressive quiet that speaks volumes about the emptiness of the land. You see ruined cottages, roofless and exposed to the sky, grim markers of lives that ended or families that fled. Sometimes you might see a lone figure shuffling along the road ahead, or perhaps resting by the side. Another soul on some desperate errand, or simply waiting. You don't know what for. You keep your distance, a mutual understanding of vulnerability and suspicion hanging in the air. Everyone is a potential competitor for scarce resources, or simply too weak to offer help. It's not exactly the scenic route, is it? No picturesque villages or friendly waves, just miles of desolation and the persistent fear that you might just keel over and disappear into the landscape yourself. Talk about a non-refundable tour. As you get closer to where the village should be, the track becomes a little more defined, worn by the few who still traverse it. You see more evidence of human presence, but it's a grim kind of evidence. Piles of stones that were once walls, overgrown pathways leading to nowhere. Then, finally, you see the cluster of buildings. It's smaller than you remember, or perhaps it just feels smaller, shrunk by the surrounding emptiness. The chimney smoke is thin and sparse, not the robust plumes of a thriving community. The air carries a smell of dampness and, yes, that persistent, unsettling odor. You make your way towards the center where the post office is located. The street is quiet, perhaps a few people moving slowly, their faces drawn and weary. No one makes eye contact. You feel like a ghost walking among ghosts. You find the post office, a small stone building, perhaps attached to a shop that is now empty or boarded up. You push open the door, and the air inside is thick with the smell of old paper and the tense, quiet anticipation of the handful of people already there. The interior is dim, lit only by a single small window and perhaps a flickering candle. There's a counter behind which sits the postmaster, a man whose face seems etched with exhaustion and perhaps a touch of irritation. He's dealing with an endless stream of desperate people, most of whom will leave disappointed. The air is thick with unspoken hopes and fears. You join the small queue, your heart hammering against your ribs, a tiny, frantic bird trapped in your chest. This is it, the culmination of miles of painful walking and days of yearning. Waiting is an exercise in mental fortitude. You try to quell the rising tide of hope, reminding yourself of the odds. How likely is it, really, that your family, scattered and vulnerable, managed to send a letter? How likely is it that it even arrived here, miles from the coast? You watch the postmaster, his movements slow and deliberate as he sorts through a small pile of papers, calling out names. Each name that isn't yours is a tiny pinprick of disappointment. You scan the faces of the others waiting, seeing mirrored in them your own anxiety and weariness. It's a silent communion of suffering. When it's finally your turn, you approach the counter, your voice barely a whisper as you give your name. The postmaster looks at you, his gaze flicking over your emaciated frame. He shuffles through the letters. Your eyes are fixed on his hands, on the papers. Every rustle, every pause feels weighted with significance. Is he about to pull out a letter, or is he just moving things around? He clears his throat. "Nothing for you today," he says, his voice flat, devoid of emotion. The words land like stones in your gut. Nothing. The journey, the pain, the hope, all for this. An empty hand, an empty answer. It's a familiar feeling, but it doesn't get any easier to bear. You manage a small, shaky nod, unable to speak. You step away from the counter, making room for the next person, your mind reeling with the abrupt end of your fragile anticipation. A mainstream historical fact about this time is that while immigration did increase dramatically during the famine, especially to North America and Britain, the majority of people remained in Ireland, trapped by poverty, illness, and the lack of available passage or funds to travel. So while the dream of a letter from abroad was powerful, the reality for most was staying put in a blighted land. It wasn't like everyone just packed up and left. That was simply impossible for the vast majority. There's also a quirky tidbit about some of the post offices acting almost like information hubs, with the postmaster sometimes reading out news from letters to gathered crowds, sharing snippets of what was happening elsewhere, or even details from relief committees or landlords. It was a strange, informal way information, and sometimes disinformation, spread in a world without easy communication. Imagine the postmaster being the village newspaper, except the headlines are just, "Yep, still hungry," or "Your cousin in Liverpool says it rains a lot." Riveting stuff. Historians still argue whether the efficiency and accessibility of the postal system during the height of the famine were adequate, or if the bureaucratic hurdles, distance, and cost essentially rendered it useless for the poorest and most isolated who needed it most. Was it a functioning system that people couldn't afford to use? Or was the system itself overwhelmed and unreliable? For you, standing there with empty hands, the specific reasons feel irrelevant. The outcome is the same. You turn and leave the post office, the journey back stretching out before you, a mirror image of the agonizing walk here, but without the fuel of hope. The silence outside feels even heavier now. The disappointment is a physical weight, making each step harder than the last. You are leaving empty-handed, returning to the relentless, boring reality of the sea. But even in this crushing moment, a tiny, stubborn part of you knows you'll probably do it again. Because what else is there? The world outside the post office doesn't offer any solace. It's the same dreary street, the same weary faces, but the crushing weight of disappointment makes everything feel heavier, duller. The air tastes like ash in your mouth, even though there's no fire nearby. Your feet, which just a little while ago seemed capable of carrying you forward on the promise of hope, now feel like lead weights. The walk back is just that, a walk back. No destination to yearn for, only the return to a place of meager subsistence, a place you left to escape, however briefly, the monotony of hunger. Each step away from the village takes you further from the faint possibility of rescue or relief. It's a retracing of steps, yes, but also a retracing of emotional ground, back towards the grim reality of the shoreline. The landscape unfolds in reverse. The ruined cottages look even sadder on the way back. The empty fields feel more accusing. You pass other figures on the road, but the brief, almost imperceptible tension of wondering if they have news or might need help or might pose a threat is gone. You're just two ships passing in the night, heading in opposite directions, bound by the same silent suffering. It's not exactly the cheerful greeting you'd expect on a Sunday stroll, is it? More like a mutual acknowledgement of shared misery. Ah, yes, you two are profoundly hungry and probably haven't had a good night's sleep in months. Jolly good. The ache in your legs, which was tolerable on the outward journey because of the distraction of hope, now becomes the dominant sensation. It's a deep, bone-weary soreness that settles into your muscles with every miserable stride. Your stomach twists, a dull, persistent knot reminding you that the small morsel of seaweed you ate hours ago is long gone, processed into meager energy that has now been expended for nothing. Hunger gnaws, but it's a familiar ache, almost comforting in its predictability compared to the sharp, emotional pain of thwarted expectation. As you get closer to the coast, the sound of the waves begins to assert itself again, a low, constant murmur that gradually drowns out the silence of the inland. The air grows cooler, moister, carrying the familiar scent of salt and decay. It's a transition from one kind of desolation to another. The inland offered the desolation of emptiness and stillness. The coast offers the desolation of relentless natural forces and our indifferent abundance of inedible things. You know, if you were writing a Yelp review for Ireland, circa 1847, it probably wouldn't get many stars. Limited dining options, poor service, view is mostly various shades of brown and gray. Would not recommend. You finally reach the familiar rocks and seaweed-strewn shore. It feels like returning home, if home was a place of constant effort and minimal reward. There's no warm fire waiting, no comfortable bed, just the cold, damp ground, and the endless task of finding the next thing to keep you alive. The brief excursion inland feels like a dream now, a fleeting moment of distraction from the main event. Surviving right here, on the edge of the sea, day after boring day. The first order of business is the familiar routine. The tide is out, or perhaps just turning. You need to check your patch, see what the sea has grudgingly offered up. The process is automatic now, ingrained through repetition. Eyes scanning the rocks for the darkest, most abundant fronds of seaweed, often Palmaria palmata, or dulce, or maybe some bladder wrack if things are really lean. Fingers, raw and cracked from the salt and cold, pull at the slippery strands. It's back-breaking work, bending over the wet rocks, the wind whipping your hair, the coals seeping into your bones. You stuff the gathered seaweed into whatever ragged container you have, a torn sack, a salvaged basket. It's not food in the way you used to think of food, not a warm potato or a crust of bread. It's just substance, something to chew, something that fills the empty space in your stomach for a little while and offers a bare minimum of calories and nutrients, mostly iodine, which you probably have in spades by now. Maybe your thyroid is having the time of its life? Who knows? You might look for shellfish if you're lucky, some mussels clinging to the rocks, maybe the rare limpet. But these are scarce now, picked over by everyone else doing the exact same thing. They offer a little variety, a bit of protein, But collecting enough to make a difference requires hours of chipping them off the rocks, often cutting your hands in the process. It's just another layer of monotonous, painful effort. Then there's the search for driftwood, for anything that might burn. A small fire, even a smoky, sputtering one, is a luxury. It offers a little warmth, a place to dry your perpetually damp clothes, and a way to soften the toughest seaweed, making it slightly easier to chew and digest. But driftwood is also increasingly hard to find, scavenged by everyone in the vicinity. It's another quiet competition, another reminder that even the basic necessities are fought over. A mainstream historical fact about this specific survival strategy is that coastal communities, or those who could reach the coast, often relied heavily on seaweed as a food source during the famine. While it couldn't sustain life indefinitely on its own and often caused digestive issues, it provided crucial calories and micronutrients that were simply unavailable inland. It wasn't a choice. It was one of the few options left when the potato crop failed repeatedly and other food sources were scarce or unaffordable. You're living proof of this grim reality. A quirky tidbit is that while many varieties of seaweed were eaten, some, like certain types of rack, were more palatable or nutritious than others, and people quickly learned which ones were best for survival, passing down this reluctant knowledge. It's like a horrifying forced version of becoming a gourmet seaweed expert. Ah yes, the Ascophyllum nodosum, a bold, rubbery flavor, pairs well with despair. Historians still argue whether the reliance on foraging from the coast, particularly seaweed, significantly delayed or prolonged the starvation process for individuals, or if it was ultimately just a temporary measure that pushed the inevitable outcome back a little, perhaps even exacerbating some health issues due to constant exposure and nutrient deficiencies. For you, it's not an academic question. It's just what you do, day in and day out. You eat the seaweed because you're still here. As the light fades, you find a sheltered spot, maybe an overhang of rock or a small hollow in the dunes if you're lucky. You huddle, pull your thin, damp clothes tighter around you, and try to get some sleep. The sound of the waves is constant. The wind is biting. The cold is a dull ache that never quite leaves you. There are no letters here, no distant promises, just the raw, immediate struggle for survival. And you repeat it tomorrow, and the day after that, and the day after that. It is the boring, exhausting, relentless rhythm of staying alive when the world has decided you shouldn't. You are back to basics, back to the boring grind. Huddled in your makeshift shelter, perhaps just a slight depression in the sand behind a dune, or a small cave-like space under an overhang of rock, the cold is the first thing that truly registers. It's not just the surface chill. It's a damp, penetrating cold that seems to soak into your bones, a constant, unwelcome companion that clings to you from the moment the sun dips below the horizon. Your clothes, thin and worn, offer little protection. And if they got wet during the day's foraging, they're still stubbornly damp, making everything worse. Sleeping in wet clothes? Not exactly the luxury Egyptian cotton sheets you might dream of. More like a perpetual bad towel day. The wind, even if your spot offers some shelter, finds ways to sneak in, a low, mournful whistle that seems to echo the emptiness in your stomach. The sound of the waves, which during the day is just background noise to the task of survival, at night becomes a more imposing presence, a constant rhythmic roar and hiss that fills the silence. It's powerful, indifferent, a reminder of the vast, cold expanse of the ocean and your own small, vulnerable place on its very edge. Hunger is a dull, persistent ache. It's no longer the sharp, demanding pang of earlier days. It's a constant, low-grade gnawing that settles deep in your gut. Your stomach grumbles occasionally, a pathetic little protest against the lack of substance within. You try to ignore it, to push it to the back of your mind, but it's always there, a hollow space that no amount of willpower can fill. You chew on a piece of the tougher seaweed, hoping it might settle things, but it's a meager comfort. Sleep doesn't come easily. How could it? You're cold, you're hungry, you're uncomfortable on the hard, uneven ground. Every shift in position is an effort, a brief respite from one ache only to uncover another. Your mind, freed from the immediate tasks of daylight survival, begins to wander. It drifts back to memories. sharp, painful flashes of a life before, the smell of a warm kitchen, the laughter of people now gone, the simple pleasure of a full belly. These memories are a cruel torment, highlighting the vast, unbridgeable chasm between then and now. Sometimes the disappointment of the day replays itself, the long walk to the village, the brief flicker of hope at the post office, the crushing weight of nothing. It circles in your thoughts, a wearying loop of what-ifs and if-onlys. What if a letter had arrived? What if someone somewhere knew you were here struggling? But no, the silence of the post office was just another echo of the silence of the world outside this immediate, desperate struggle. It's like waiting for your Amazon package delivery confirmation email. But the internet hasn't been invented yet, and neither has Amazon, and all you're waiting for is maybe, a crust of bread. A bit anticlimactic, really. The boredom is also a heavy weight. Survival is not a thrilling adventure movie. It is repetitive, monotonous, soul-crushingly boring. The days are filled with the same tasks. Search, forage, eat, shiver. The nights are filled with the same struggle. Shiver, ache, try to sleep, fail. The lack of stimulation, the absence of anything new or interesting, grinds you down. It's a different kind of hunger, a hunger for something more than just bare existence. A mainstream historical fact relevant here is that exposure to the elements was a massive killer during the famine, often exacerbated by malnutrition. People lacked adequate housing, clothing, and heating, making conditions like hypothermia and respiratory illnesses tragically common, even if they managed to find some food. Simply surviving the night outdoors was a significant challenge, chipping away at their already weakened bodies. A quirky tidbit might be that some people developed incredibly localized knowledge of the coast, learning which tiny nooks or specific piles of rocks offered the best windbreaks or the least damp spots, skills honed purely out of the desperate necessity to find a slightly less miserable place to spend the night. They became reluctant experts in miserable real estate. Ah yes, this particular crevice, 5 stars for minimal drafts, 0 stars for amenities. Historians still argue whether the psychological toll of the famine, the constant stress, despair, loss, and sheer monotony, contributed as significantly to mortality rates as the physical effects of starvation and disease, or if the physical ailments were the primary drivers, with mental distress being a devastating but secondary consequence. For you, lying here in the cold, the two seem inextricably linked. The despair makes the physical pain harder to bear, and the physical pain deepens the despair. You pull your knees tighter to your chest, try to tuck your hands into your armpits for warmth. You close your eyes, willing yourself to find some oblivion in sleep. Maybe, just maybe, if you can sleep, the hours will pass faster, and the dawn will come, bringing with it the faint possibility of finding something, anything that might help you survive another day. It's not a restful state, it's more a state of weary resignation, of waiting. Waiting for the night to end, waiting for the hunger to subside, waiting for a miracle that never seems to arrive. You are just waiting, cold and alone, for the boring, relentless cycle to begin again with the first gray light of morning. Another night survived, barely. The gray light doesn't so much dawn as it simply arrives, seeping into the world and chasing away the deepest shadows. The wind off the sea feels even colder now, carrying the scent of salt and damp rock. You stir from your miserable attempt at sleep, joints stiff, muscles aching from the hard ground in the relentless cold of the night. There's no point lingering. Lying there achieves nothing but prolonging the discomfort. So you push yourself up, maybe doing a little shimmy to try and shake some life back into your frozen limbs. It probably looks less like a dignified stretch and more like a sea-battered scarecrow attempting a questionable dance move. The first order of business every single day is the forage. It's the foundation of your survival, the dreary, never-ending quest for sustenance. You pull yourself out of your makeshift shelter and head towards the shoreline. The tide will be out, or going out, depending on the timing, revealing the treasures, or more often, the distinct lack of treasures of the intertidal zone. This is where you spend your day, walking, looking down, constantly looking down. Your gaze sweeps across the wet rocks, the exposed sand, the pools left by the receding tide. You're looking for kelp, wrack, dillisk, carrageen, any kind of seaweed that is edible, or at least chewable enough to provide some bulk, however little nutritional value. You're looking for limpets clinging to the rocks, tiny conical shells that require patience and a bit of effort to pry off. Maybe, if you're incredibly lucky, a cluster of mussels, though those are often picked clean by others or simply not found in abundance on your particular stretch of coast. It's a repetitive, monotonous patrol. Step, scan, bend down to inspect something that looked promising, but turns out to just be a whetstone or a piece of driftwood. Stand up, move on. The rhythm is mind-numbing. Your feet are perpetually damp, your hands are cold and often scratched from scrambling over barnacle-encrusted rocks. Your back aches from bending, and your neck is stiff from always looking downwards. This is survival, not grand battles or daring escapes, but endless, tedious searching. It's like playing a video game where the main objective is collect 50,000 units of common rock. Except there's no satisfying level-up screen, just the ongoing need to collect more rock-like seaweed. You learn the patterns of the tide, the specific spots where certain types of seaweed tend to wash up, the rocks that are more likely to host limpets. This isn't exciting knowledge. It's born purely of necessity, a grim expertise in scavenging. Each tiny limpet you manage to pry off feels like a minor victory, a minuscule addition to the day's meager calories. Eating them raw, straight from the shell, is less a culinary experience and more a practical fueling decision. They taste purely of the sea, cold, salty, and metallic. Definitely not Michelin star material. A mainstream historical fact is that for communities living near the coast, seaweed and shellfish became absolutely critical food sources during the famine, particularly as the potato crop failed and other food sources became scarce or unaffordable. These resources, while often poor in calories and nutrients compared to potatoes or grain, were sometimes the only thing standing between people and immediate starvation, though relying solely on them led to malnutrition and deficiency diseases. A quirky tidbit involves the sheer variety of seaweed that was identified and consumed. People developed local names and knowledge for dozens of different types, learning which ones were less likely to cause stomach upset, which were slightly more palatable, or which could be dried and stored for a short time. This wasn't scientific classification. It was purely empirical knowledge built through trial and error, often with unpleasant consequences for the errors. Imagine a whole informal taxonomy based on makes you feel slightly less awful versus definitely gives you the cramps. Historians still argue whether coastal communities, despite having access to seaweed and shellfish, were ultimately better off or merely experienced a slightly delayed or different form of suffering compared to inland communities. Given the poor nutritional value of the coastal foods and the harsh conditions of coastal living, for you, the distinction feels somewhat academic. Whether your suffering is delayed or direct, it is still very much suffering. You continue your patrol, the sun, if it appears at all, a pale, watery disk offering little warmth. The wind whips at your thin clothes. The sound of the waves is constant, a reminder of the vastness and indifference of nature. You scan, you bend, you pry, you eat the cold, salty finds. There's no conversation, no distraction, just the rhythm of the search and the quiet ache in your gut. It's boring. It's difficult. It's survival in its most stripped-down, repetitive form, and the day stretches out ahead, promising many more hours of the same before the cold, hungry night arrives again. You just keep walking, hoping against hope for just one more limpet, one more handful of edible weed. The monotonous quest for not quite starving continues. The days blur into a monotonous cycle. Cold, damp sleep, the endless, back-aching patrol of the tide line, the meager meal of rubbery seaweed and gritty limpets, and then the cold, damp sleep again. This is your world now, the vast, indifferent ocean and the hard, unyielding land. There's no news, no change, nothing to mark the passage of time except the state of the tide and the slow erosion of your own strength. It's a gray, relentless existence, and honestly, it's incredibly boring. You'd kill for a dramatic plot twist, like maybe a pirate ship washing ashore laden with hardtack. But no, just more rocks and seaweed. Then something happens, something that breaks the pattern, even if only for a brief, intense period. Someone arrives. Usually it's the postman, or whoever is filling that role now, a gaunt, tired figure traversing the difficult paths from the nearest town, carrying the precious, often heartbreaking, cargo of letters. Not everyone gets letters, of course. Only those with family who manage to leave this place, who scrape together the fare for the coffin ships and brave the Atlantic crossing. And today, improbably, miraculously, one of those letters is for you. The news spreads like wildfire through the small, scattered community clinging to the coast. A letter. So-and-so got a letter. A small crowd gathers, drawn by the sheer novelty, the faint echo of connection to a world beyond the struggle. Your hands tremble slightly as you take the folded paper. It feels impossibly light, and yet it carries the weight of unimaginable distances, of journeys you could only dream of lives lived far away. You find a relatively sheltered spot, perhaps behind a large rock or a crumbling wall, and unfold the letter, your heart hammering against your ribs. The paper is thin, the ink sometimes smudged, but the writing is familiar. It's from your cousin, or your sibling, or your neighbor who left 2 years ago for Boston or New York. You read slowly, painstakingly, the words sometimes blurring through a sudden, unexpected film of tears. They talk of the journey, difficult, crowded, but survived. They talk of America, bustling, loud, filled with strange people and even stranger customs. They talk of finding work, hard work, often dangerous work, but work nonetheless. And they talk of sending money. This is the part that makes the surrounding faces light up with vicarious hope, the part that tightens a knot in your own stomach. They've sent money, a few dollars, maybe a pound note, a fortune here, enough to buy a sack of meal, enough to perhaps stave off hunger for a few weeks, or maybe help one other family member get away. The letter might contain the actual money, carefully folded within the paper, or it might promise a draft to be collected in town, a perilous journey in itself. Reading the letter is an emotional roller coaster. There's immense relief and gratitude that your family made it, that they are alive and relatively well. There's a surge of hope that this money might help, a lifeline thrown across the ocean. But there's also a crushing wave of other feelings. Envy, bitter and sharp, that they are there eating their fill, perhaps even seeing their futures stretch out, while you are here gnawing on seaweed. Guilt, profound and heavy, that you couldn't go or didn't go, or that someone else in the family is more deserving of the help. Sadness for those who left, knowing the hardship they must have endured, and for those left behind, knowing the hardship you endure. The letter is reread, passed around if you're willing to share, and sometimes even if you're not, in this close, desperate proximity. People listen intently to the descriptions of America, conjuring images of a promised land utterly unlike the reality of their own lives. It's like reading a fantasy novel, only the main character is someone you actually know. Imagine meat every day, someone might gasp, and you have to fight back a weary, sarcastic laugh. Meat? You haven't seen meat that wasn't roadkill or a snatched bird in longer than you can remember. A mainstream historical fact is that remittances sent by Irish immigrants from North America and Britain became a vital source of income for families back in Ireland during the famine years and long after. These small sums of money, earned through incredibly hard labor in foreign lands, kept countless people alive and often funded the passage for other family members to join them, creating a powerful and enduring economic link between the diaspora and those who remained. It was a literal lifeline, paid for in sweat and longing. A quirky tidbit concerns the postal system itself during this period. Despite the immense disruption and hardship, efforts were made to maintain mail service, but the challenges were immense. Roads were poor, postmen were sometimes ill or starving themselves, and delivery could be incredibly erratic. A letter promised from America might take weeks or months to arrive, if it arrived at all, adding another layer of anxiety and uncertainty to the already fragile hopes of receiving help. Imagine waiting months for a confirmation email, only you're starving and the email contains dinner plans. Historians still argue whether emigration, while a clear escape route for individuals, ultimately weakened or strengthened the social fabric of the communities left behind? Did it drain away the young and strong, leaving the vulnerable more exposed? Or did the remittances and eventual opportunities abroad provide the only viable path to survival and future prosperity for the wider family network? For you, holding the letter in your hand, it feels like both a cruel reminder of what you lack and a tiny flicker of possibility you can barely grasp. The letter is eventually folded away, tucked somewhere safe, perhaps inside your inadequate clothes. The brief excitement fades. The questions and anxieties raised by its contents linger, but the immediate reality reasserts itself. The tide is still out. You are still hungry. The foraging must continue. The letter offered a glimpse of another world, a pang of complex emotion, but it didn't change the fundamental, boring, difficult truth of your survival. You still need seaweed, you still need limpets, and the sun is already starting its slow descent, promising another cold night. The brief, bittersweet jolt of the letter fades, leaving you adrift in the familiar currents of hunger and fatigue. That flicker of connection, of hope for a world elsewhere, only serves to sharpen the edges of the reality you inhabit. Your body is a constant, low-grade ache, not the sharp pain of a wound, but the deep, bone-weary exhaustion that settles into your very marrow. Every movement is an effort. Lifting your arm to brush away a fly feels like lifting a stone. Your legs are heavy, leaden things that protest with every step along the uneven shore. The world outside shrinks. Your focus narrows to the immediate, the essential. Finding enough to eat, finding shelter from the persistent damp and cold, mustering the energy to perform these basic tasks. Grand plans, hopes for the future, even memories of the past, they all feel distant, like whispers heard through thick fog. Your mind seems to mirror the physical decline, becoming slower, less sharp. You find yourself staring blankly at the waves for long stretches, the simple rhythm of the water mesmerizing in its indifference. This isn't profound meditation, it's just depletion. Your brain, deprived of adequate fuel, is running on low power mode. You're basically a smartphone at 3%, desperately trying to conserve battery. There's a pervasive sense of apathy. It's hard to care about much beyond your own immediate survival. Other people's struggles, while visible all around you, feel distant, almost abstract. You see the same gaunt faces, the same desperate eyes, the same slow shuffling gait, but the capacity for deep empathy seems to have withered, like a plant without water. This is one of the insidious cruelties of prolonged deprivation. It hollows you out, not just physically, but emotionally. It's the ultimate me-first survival tactic enforced by biology, which is kind of depressing when you think about it. Sleep offers little true rest. You drift in and out of consciousness, haunted by dreams of food, impossible feasts of roast meats, steaming potatoes, fresh bread with butter. You wake up more hungry than before, the phantom tastes lingering cruelly on your tongue. The cold seeps into your sleeping place, chilling you to the bone, leaving you shivering and stiff when the gray dawn arrives. Getting up is a monumental act of will, a victory over the inertia that wants to keep you huddled, conserving what little warmth and energy you possess. The monotony is soul-crushing. Day after day, it's the same routine. Wake, forage, eat or attempt to, shiver, sleep, repeat. The only variation is the weather, which is usually just a spectrum of damp, cold, and windy. There's no news, no entertainment, no distractions. Your world has shrunk to this small, bleak stretch of coast. You could probably write a doctoral thesis on the subtle differences between various types of seaweed textures now, if you had the energy or the paper. You're a reluctant connoisseur of kelp, a gourmand of bladderwrack. Lucky you. A mainstream historical fact about this period is the widespread prevalence of disease, which often proved more fatal than starvation itself. Conditions like typhus, dysentery, and scurvy ravaged the weakened population. Malnutrition severely compromised immune systems, turning common illnesses into death sentences. Camps or areas where people gathered seeking relief or emigration were often hotbeds for contagion, the close proximity accelerating the spread of disease among people already at their most vulnerable. Your constant weariness isn't just from hunger. Your body is fighting battles you don't even know are happening. A quirky, though grim, tidbit from the time mentions that as people grew weaker, their physical appearance could change dramatically. In advanced stages of starvation and related deficiencies like scurvy, caused by lack of vitamin C, which is not abundant in your seaweed diet, unfortunately, skin could become discolored, loose and bruised, gums could swell and bleed, and hair could become brittle and fall out. Some accounts describe an aged look even on young faces. It's the original terrible anti-beauty treatment. Forget collagen, try eating nothing but salty plants for a year. Please don't actually try that. Historians still argue whether the psychological trauma inflicted by the famine, including the pervasive apathy and emotional numbing you feel, had long-lasting intergenerational effects on the Irish population. Did the experience of such profound helplessness and loss permanently alter cultural attitudes towards risk, immigration, community support, or even mental health? For you, right now, it just feels like you can barely string two thoughts together, let alone contemplate the long-term psychological impact of your current situation on your hypothetical great-grandchildren. The letter you received is tucked away, a small, folded promise of a world you can barely access. It's a reminder that life exists beyond this, but it also highlights the vast, impossible distance between there and here. The money, if it came, might offer a temporary reprieve, perhaps enough to buy a few handfuls of meal, a brief respite from the gnawing hunger. But it doesn't solve the fundamental problem. It doesn't restore your strength, or erase the apathy, or banish the constant weary cold. It's a patch on a gaping wound. And soon, the effects of that temporary relief will fade, and you'll be back to the tide line, the seaweed, the slow, boring decline. The tide waits for no one, not even someone who just got mail from America. Time to go check the rocks again. So you're back on the shore, aren't you? The tide is out, exposing the slippery, treacherous rocks that are your primary grocery store. The letter is tucked away, a distant echo. The hunger is very much here, a constant, low thrum in your gut. You step carefully, testing each foothold. The rocks are covered in a slack, dark film, and a misplaced step could send you tumbling, a prospect you'd rather avoid. A broken limb out here is pretty much a death sentence, or at least a fast track to being a liability someone else has to deal with, which often amounts to the same thing. Survival here means avoiding additional problems. You've got enough on your plate, or more accurately, you don't have enough on your plate, and that's the main problem. The air smells perpetually of salt and damp earth, a smell that used to feel bracing, maybe even pleasant. Now it just smells like work, like survival. You scan the rocks, looking for the familiar shapes of the more palatable seaweeds. There's the long, ribbon-like kelp, often tough but relatively abundant. There's bladderwrack with its little air pockets, easier to spot but not much substance. And if you're really lucky, maybe some dillisk or carrageenan moss clinging to the lower rocks. Dillisk can sometimes be eaten dried, like a salty, chewy snack, which sounds glamorous until you try it. Carrageenan can be boiled down to make a sort of jelly, which sounds less like food and more like something you'd use to glue things together, but it does provide a tiny amount of calories and minerals. Reaching for the clumps of seaweed requires bending, stretching, getting your hands wet and cold in the tide pools. Your fingers are often numb, stiff. You pull at the fronds, trying to detach them from the rock. Sometimes they come away easily, other times they cling stubbornly, as if the rock itself knows you're trying to steal its meager covering. This isn't like picking berries or digging potatoes. It's a wrestling match with the ocean floor. And the ocean floor usually wins, leaving you with a handful of slimy green or brown stuff and aching muscles. It's kind of like competitive gardening, but the garden is submerged and the prize is slightly less awful food. The taste is relentlessly samey, salty, vaguely fishy, sometimes with a gritty texture from sand you can't quite wash off. Your digestive system has, against all odds, adapted somewhat. The initial nausea and discomfort that came within this diet have lessened, replaced by a dull, persistent ache and a body that just seems resigned to the situation. You're a walking testament to human adaptability, unfortunately in the least exciting way possible. Your body is basically saying, fine, we'll run on pond scum and salt, whatever, just keep us going. You're not the only one on the shore. Other figures, equally gaunt, are scattered along the coastline, hunched over the rocks, performing the same slow, desperate search. There's a silent understanding between you. No one talks much. There's nothing to say. You're all in the same boat, or rather stranded on the same rocky shore, eating the same salty plants. Sometimes a brief nod or a weary glance is exchanged, but mostly you exist in separate bubbles of hunger and fatigue. It's like a really depressing co-working space, except the only networking happening is sharing the limited resource of conveniently located seaweed. A mainstream historical fact is that access to coastal resources like seaweed and shellfish did provide a crucial, albeit meager, source of sustenance for many coastal communities during the famine, especially as inland crops have failed entirely. While certainly not enough to prevent starvation and disease, it offered a lifeline that wasn't available to those living further inland, who often faced complete destitution once their potato crop vanished and their landlords offered no relief. So you being here, wrestling with kelp, is part of a broader, desperate strategy employed by thousands. You're a statistic, a data point in the history of eating weird stuff to stay alive. A quirky, somewhat grim tidbit relates to the legal status of coastal foraging. Historically, the right to gather seaweed was often a complex issue tied to land ownership and specific local customs. During the famine, as desperation grew, people sometimes trespassed or came into conflict over access to the best foraging spots. There are accounts of minor scuffles or disputes arising from competition for these dwindling resources, a stark illustration of how the basic need for food could erode community cohesion. You probably aren't contemplating property law as you yank on a piece of bladder wrack, but it's a reminder that even this basic act wasn't always straightforward. Historians still argue whether the reliance on a few staple resources like potatoes and, in coastal areas, fish and seaweed, contributed to nutritional deficiencies beyond simple calorie lack, potentially exacerbating the effects of starvation and disease. Was the famine primarily a calorie crisis, or was it also a micronutrient crisis amplified by a lack of dietary diversity? For you, all you know is that you feel utterly drained, constantly tired, and the seaweed isn't exactly making you feel like you could run a marathon or even power walk to the next village. It's keeping you alive, yes, but not exactly thriving. Thriving feels like a concept from another dimension entirely. You straighten up, back aching, hands cold. You've gathered a small pile. It's not much, never enough, but it's something. The wind whips around you, carrying the spray from the waves. The sun, if it's out, offers little warmth at this time of year. Your clothes are damp, stiff with salt. The prospect of going back to your shelter, boiling this stuff, if you have fuel, or just eating it raw is less appealing than staying out here in the biting wind. But you have to. This is the cycle, the boring, repetitive, energy-sapping cycle. Time to haul your meager harvest back and face the reality of dinner. Hauling that meager seaweed harvest back feels like climbing a mountain. Even though it's just a few hundred yards to your shelter, your arms ache, your shoulders slump, and the damp, salty bundle feels heavier with every step. The wind is still persistent, finding its way through the thin layers of your clothes. You crest a small rise, and there it is. Home sweet. Well, home. It's not much to look at, a structure cobbled together from whatever materials were readily available. Salvaged bits of wood, some rough-cut peat sods, maybe a few larger stones, topped with a roof of thatch or reeds, probably not fastened down as securely as you'd like. It's less a building, more a hopeful pile of stuff that mostly keeps the worst of the weather out. Mostly, stepping inside is less a relief and more a change of discomfort. The air is damp, thick with the smell of earth, old peat smoke, if you've been lucky enough to burn any recently, and just general survival. The floor is bare earth, uneven and often muddy near the entrance. There are no windows, just perhaps a low doorway, often covered with a piece of sacking or an old blanket to try and keep the draft out. Light is minimal, filtering in through cracks or the smoke hole in the roof, if there is one. It's dim, cold, and the opposite of cozy. Think of it as extreme minimalist living, minus the trendy aesthetic and plus the constant existential dread. The truth is, maintaining this place is a job in itself, and it's never finished. The elements are your relentless landlord, constantly trying to evict you. Wind finds gaps in the walls, pulling at the thatch. Rain seeps through weak spots in the roofs, creating puddles and drips inside. The damp is pervasive. Everything feels clammy to the touch. Your clothes, your thin bedding, the walls themselves, all seem to absorb the moisture from the air. It's like living inside a perpetually soggy biscuit, except less tasty. So, a significant portion of your non-foraging, non-sleeping time it is spent on shelter maintenance. So, this isn't major construction, it's constant, tedious patching. If the wind has loosened some thatch, you have to clamber up. Carefully, you really don't need a fall right now, and try to push it back into place or tie it down with whatever cordage you can find. If a sod wall is crumbling, you mix some mud and try to smear it back together. If a gust has ripped a hole in your door covering, you try to sew it up with a bone needle and plant fiber, or just stuff a bit of rag in the gap. It's the kind of work that feels utterly Sisyphean. You fix one leak and a new one appears. You reinforce one corner and another part starts to sag. There's no sense of accomplishment, just a brief reprieve before the next minor structural failure. It's like playing a never-ending game of whack-a-mole, but the moles are drafts and damp spots, and the mallet is a soggy piece of peat. Thrilling stuff, truly. Your hands, already raw from foraging, are often scraped and dirty from handling earth and rough materials. This constant struggle with inadequate housing was a widespread reality during the famine. A mainstream historical fact is that the quality of housing for the rural poor in Ireland was already notoriously bad before the famine, often consisting of mud cabins with thatched roofs. The crisis only exacerbated this, as people had less energy and fewer resources to maintain even these poor structures, leaving them even more exposed to the harsh Irish weather, which contributed significantly to illness, particularly respiratory diseases and fevers that swept through the population. Your damp, drafty hut isn't just uncomfortable, it's actively trying to make you sick. A quirky, though sad, tidbit is that in some areas, as people were evicted or their homes collapsed, they would sometimes dig scalps, shallow pits in the ground covered with rudimentary roofs, for shelter. These were literally just holes in the earth, offering minimal protection. While your current dwelling feels barely adequate, the thought of a scalp makes it seem relatively luxurious. It puts the whole roughing it concept into a rather bleak perspective. Historians still argue whether the direct effects of starvation killed more people during the famine than the diseases that thrived in the conditions of overcrowding, poor sanitation, and inadequate shelter. Was it primarily the lack of food, or was it the combination of malnutrition and the terrible living conditions that proved the deadliest? For you, the distinction feels academic. You're fighting both fronts simultaneously, trying to get enough calories from seaweed while also trying not to freeze or catch pneumonia in your leaky, earth-floored dwelling. The damp seeps into your bones, a constant chill that no amount of thin blanket seems to entirely dispel. As the light fades, you prepare the seaweed if you have fuel for a fire. Boiling it down makes it slightly more palatable, maybe less likely to cause digestive upset, and uses up a tiny precious amount of your fuel stock. If you don't have fuel, it's just raw, slimy plant matter, chewed slowly in the dim light. The sound of the wind outside, rattling the thatch or whistling through cracks, is a constant reminder of the fragility of your walls. You huddle in the corner that seems least damp, trying to ignore the drips, the cold, the gnawing emptiness in your stomach. This is your reality, the boring, cold, damp reality. And tomorrow you'll probably have to patch that corner near the entrance again. The taste of boiled or dried seaweed becomes the background noise of your existence. It's a constant, slightly bitter, intensely salty flavor that lingers long after the last chewy mouthful. You eat it because you must, because it provides a dull ache of fullness that keeps the worst gnawing hunger at bay. But it offers little joy, less variety, and certainly not enough true sustenance for the long haul. Your body feels constantly tired, your bones heavy, your mind sluggish. Life on the rocks and shore is a grinding, repetitive struggle against tide, weather, and the sheer unappetizing nature of your primary food source. And so your thoughts, naturally, begin to drift. They drift inland, beyond the immediate, smelly reality of the coast. They drift across the gray Atlantic. They drift to family, to friends, who managed to scrape together passage money or were sent away on earlier ships, fleeing this very landscape before the blight truly set in its teeth. You remember the stories? The hopeful letters that used to arrive, talking of work, of possibilities, of streets paved with, well, maybe not gold, but certainly something more substantial than slippery seaweed. That hope, that distant, almost mythical lifeline, starts to occupy more space in your mind than the immediate task of prying damp fronds off wet stone. The seaweed provides calories, yes, but the idea of a letter provides something else entirely, a spark of possibility, a chance for actual money, perhaps even a ticket for passage to a new life. It's a flicker of agency in a world where agency has been stripped away, leaving only reaction and endurance. It's a hope tied to something far beyond your current grim horizon. The focal point of this new desperate hope is the post office, or perhaps not a dedicated building, but wherever the mail is known to arrive and be distributed in the nearest town or village that hasn't completely dissolved into ghost-like desolation. You hear whispers, rumors carried on the wind like seeds. So-and-so got a letter. Someone in Ballyhooly got money from America. They say there's a ticket arrived for the O'Brien girl. These stories, whether embellished or true, are potent fuel for a starving mind. They transform the abstract concept of emigration into a tangible, albeit slim, possibility of rescue. Making the journey inland again is an effort. You've settled in a way into the rhythm of the coast, harsh as it is. To leave it means leaving the relative security of your seaweed supply, as unappealing as that security is. It means walking, expending precious energy, facing the desolation of the interior once more. The silent fields, the empty cottages, the roads traveled by gaunt figures heading in every direction, all seeking something that isn't there. But the pull of the post office, the magnetic force of potential deliverance, starts to outweigh the practical concerns. So you gather what little you can, a dried piece of dulse to chew on the way, maybe a small amount of salvaged something or other, if you were lucky. You pull your threadbare coat tighter around you and turn your back on the sea. The air changes as you move inland, losing its sharp, briny tang and becoming heavier, still damp, but with the smell of peat smoke if there's any left, or just the damp earth itself. The landscape unfolds with a terrible familiarity. The stone walls, the skeletal remains of potato stalks in the fields, the quiet, unnerving emptiness. Walking takes time. Your legs ache, your stomach cramps intermittently, reminding you that seaweed, while filling, isn't exactly giving you boundless energy. You pass others on the road, mostly walking too, often in silence, sometimes exchanging a brief, weary nod. You wonder what their destination is. Are they also heading towards the siren song of the post office? Or are they going elsewhere, seeking different, equally unlikely salvation? It's a strange, silent migration driven by a shared, desperate need. Finally, you arrive at the town or village that serves as the nexus for this fragile network of hope. It might not look like much, a cluster of buildings, a church perhaps, and the building that houses the all-important post office. This building, whatever it looks like, is different from the others. It's a place of congregation, a place of nervous energy, a place where hope and despair meet daily in quiet, heart-wrenching encounters. Outside the post office, or perhaps inside a small, crowded waiting area, you see them. Others, people like you, waiting with a patience born of desperation, their faces etched with anxiety and anticipation. Some have been coming here for days, for weeks, making the journey over and over again, driven by the faint possibility that today might be the day. There's a low hum of quiet conversation. Questions whispered. Any mail today? Did anyone hear about the packet from Boston? Historians still argue whether the system of remittances from emigrants significantly alleviated the suffering of those who remained behind on a large scale, or if its impact was primarily limited to those with family already established and earning in places like North America. For you, standing there, the academic debate is meaningless. All that matters is the possibility. It represents a force outside the immediate, crushing reality of famine, a potential bypass around starvation that doesn't rely on blighted land or inedible sea plants. It's a lifeline thrown from a distance, and you are clinging to the hope that the rope will reach you. The process of checking for mail is slow, perhaps handled by an overwhelmed clerk or simply posted on a list if the mail has arrived. Your name, you wait to hear your name called or scan the list with tired eyes. Every time someone else's name is called, there's a small ripple, either quiet congratulations for them if they receive something, or a shared sigh of resignation from the crowd if it's just another circular or an official notice nobody wants. It's a strangely communal experience, this waiting, bound by a shared vulnerability and a shared, fragile hope. And the thought, a dark, gentle joke that barely forms in your mind, is that this is probably the most exciting thing that happens all week, waiting for bureaucratic salvation. Who knew the Postal Service could be such a dramatic focal point? The days blur into a cycle: gather seaweed, eat seaweed, journey inland, wait at the post office, return to the coast, repeat. The waiting itself becomes an endurance test, a different kind of hunger. The hunger for news, for a sign that you haven't been forgotten, that somewhere out there people care enough to send help. A quirky tidbit you might overhear or recall is that the volume of remittances actually increased dramatically during the famine years, a testament to the strong family ties and the sacrifices made by immigrants to help those left behind, even as their own lives were just starting in a new, often harsh environment. It wasn't just pennies. Sometimes it was significant sums, enough to buy a little meal or even secure passage. But mostly there is just the waiting, the silence when your name isn't called, the long walk back, the taste of salt in your mouth again, the gray sea stretching endlessly. The hope doesn't die, not entirely, but it shrinks, becoming a smaller, colder ember in the vast emptiness of your stomach and your future. Yet, you know you will come back. You have to. Because the alternative is just the seaweed, forever. The routine solidifies, hardening like the salt crust on the rocks you scavenge from. Eat seaweed, walk inland, wait, return, eat more seaweed, wait again. It's a rhythm of desperation, a loop that feels increasingly inescapable. Your body thins further, your clothes hang loose, and the constant, slight tremor in your hands is just another fact of life, like the damp chill that never seems to leave your bones. The faces of the others waiting at the post office blur into a single gaunt expression of hopeful weariness. You know their stories without hearing them. The brother in New York, the sister in Boston, the cousin who promised to send passage money as soon as they could save it. Every day, the silence when your name isn't called echoes louder than any shouted news. It's not just the absence of a letter, it's the absence of hope. The chilling confirmation that for another day you remain stranded, anchored to this starving land by poverty and circumstance. You start to doubt the stories you heard, the rumors of remittances and tickets. Maybe they were just folklore, whispered comforts in a world devoid of them. The thought, a dark, gentle joke you wouldn't dare voice, is that this is the ultimate customer service test, waiting for a delivery that literally means the difference between life and, well, more waiting, followed by something far worse. And then one day something shifts. The air in the small, crowded space feels different, and there's a sharper edge to the anticipation. The clerk, usually a figure of weary indifference, seems a little more animated, perhaps burdened by the sheer volume of something different today. Or maybe it's just your imagination, a trick of a mind desperate for a sign. You stand there leaning against a wall for support, watching the faces, listening to the names being called out, trying to control the frantic thumping in your chest that even the constant low-level hunger can't entirely suppress. A name is called, not yours. A wave of familiar disappointment starts to wash over you. But then, another name, and another, and then your name. It hangs in the air for a second, foreign and significant in this place of anonymity. Your heart lurches, a painful, dizzying sensation. Is this real? You push yourself forward, your legs feeling weak, towards the counter. The clerk looks at you, confirms your identity with a brief, assessing glance, and holds out a letter. And something else. A small, folded paper, maybe. Or coins wrapped in cloth. It's real. The letter, when you manage to open it with trembling fingers, is from family. Family who made it across the ocean. They write of hardship. Yes, life isn't easy there either, but there is work. There is food, and they have saved. They have scraped together what little they could, denying themselves much because they haven't forgotten you. Inside the letter, or perhaps handed to you with it, is the remittance. Not a king's ransom, not enough to solve all your problems or feed a village, but enough for food for a little while. Enough, crucially, to potentially make the next step. And there it is, the mention you've been praying for, an opportunity for passage. Perhaps they've sent enough for a ticket on a coming ship. Or maybe they mention a connection, a way to get aboard, a specific person to find when you reach the port. The details are hazy, the journey daunting, but the word, Aishwal, Sobergerd, is there, passage, a way out. Reading the letter feels surreal. The words blur through a film of tears you didn't realize you were shedding. It's a jolt of warmth in a world of cold, gray survival. It's proof that the thread of connection across the Atlantic hasn't broken. It's a quirky tidbit that resonates deeply now. How these remittances, often sent despite immense personal sacrifice by the senders who were barely making ends meet themselves in their new homes, became a vital, if insufficient, source of aid during the famine, bypassing official channels and reaching families directly. But with the relief comes a complex mix of emotions. Guilt, perhaps, that you are receiving this when so many others waiting got nothing. Fear of the unknown journey ahead. And sadness, profound sadness, at the thought of leaving behind the land, the ghosts, everything you've ever known, even in its current state of ruin. Historians still argue whether mass immigration was a necessary evil, draining Ireland of its population and vitality, but saving countless lives. Or if it was a forced displacement that further crippled the nation by removing its young and able. For you, clutching this letter and the precious remittance, the academic debate is as distant as the land the letter came from. It's not about the nation now, it's about personal survival. This letter is your chance. The reality quickly sets in. This money won't last long here. To make the most of this opportunity, you need to act. The thought of the long journey to a port, likely Cork or Dublin, or even further, is exhausting. You've grown used to the short, grim cycle of the coast. Leaving it means venturing into the unknown, facing the inland roads again, but this time with a specific destination and a desperate purpose. This money is a lifeline, but it's also a ticking clock. The journey to the port city is another trial. You travel light, what little you have easily carried. The money is hidden carefully, a small bulge against your skin, a constant source of anxiety. You encounter more people on the roads, many heading towards the ports, drawn by the same desperate hope of passage. The coastal routine of seaweed, scavenging, and waiting for letters is over. Now, the focus shifts entirely to the journey, the ship, the vast, terrifying ocean that separates you from the possibility of survival. And the thought, a quiet, weary joke to yourself, is that after all that waiting, now you have to actually do something physically demanding. Typical, the port city is overwhelming. Crowded, noisy, full of desperation and the harsh realities of securing passage. But you hold on to the letter, the tangible proof that someone is waiting for you, that this isn't just a blind leap into the void. The taste of seaweed is still faintly on your tongue, a reminder of the life you are trying to escape. Now the taste of anticipation, of fear, and of a fragile, budding hope is what occupies your senses. The port city is a maelstrom of noise and desperation. Unlike the grim quiet of the coast, this place hums with frantic energy. Sailors shouting, vendors hawking stale bread, families huddled on the docks with their meager belongings, the air thick with the smell of brine, coal smoke, and unwashed bodies. It's a chaotic marketplace of survival, and your letter and remittance are your currency. You navigate the throng, clutching the precious paper, searching for the contact or the ticket office mentioned in the letter. Everyone looks haggard, thin, their eyes scanning the ships anchored in the harbor with a mixture of desperate hope and bone-deep weariness. You see the same hollow-cheeked look you see in your own reflection in a rare puddle. It's like a convention of everyone who drew the short straw. Finding the right place or person takes time, involves asking hesitant questions, facing brusque dismissals, and fending off opportunists. The money makes you a target, a flash of potential in a sea of destitution. You learn quickly to keep it hidden, to lower your gaze, to appear as anonymous as possible. The process is dehumanizing. You are not a person seeking passage, but a transaction. Another body to fill a space on a ship designed for cargo, not comfort. It feels like trying to buy a luxury yacht with pocket change, except the stakes are your life, and the luxury is a spot in steerage. Finally, you locate the place. It might be a cramped, smoky office, or just a busy corner of the docks where a man with a ledger is taking names and money. The process is swift and brutal. The remittance is counted, exchanged for a scrap of paper that serves as your ticket. There are no pleasantries, no reassurances about the voyage, just a curt instruction about where and when to board. It feels anticlimactic after all the waiting, all the journeying. This flimsy piece of paper is the culmination of years of suffering, the final step born from starvation and death. It's almost funny in a deeply unfunny way, reduced to a barcode essentially. Boarding the ship is another shock. These aren't passenger liners. They are often cargo vessels pressed into service, or purpose-built emigrant ships that were overcrowded, poorly ventilated, and lacked adequate provisions or sanitation. You descend into the steerage hold, a dark, cavernous space already packed with hundreds of people. Bunks are crammed together, stacked high, leaving little room to move. The air is stifling, heavy with the smell of illness, fear, and confined humanity. This is what they called coffin ships, a grimly accurate nickname. It's a mainstream historical fact, but experiencing it, feeling the press of bodies, seeing the desperate faces crammed into the gloom, makes the statistic horribly real. You wonder if anyone thought, maybe we should put fewer people in this floating box. Apparently not. Finding your allocated space is a struggle, navigating bodies and bundles. The space is tiny, maybe shared with others. You curl up, trying to make yourself small, clutching your few possessions. The ship begins to stir, engines groaning, ropes creaking. The movement is subtle at first, a gentle sway, then more pronounced as tugs guide the vessel out of the harbor. You feel a tremor deep within the ship, the churning of the screw, or the paddle wheels starting. Looking back up through hatches or portholes, if there are any visible from your spot, you catch glimpses of the coastline receding. The land you were so desperate to leave, the land that tried to kill you, is slipping away. It's a strange, complex feeling. Relief, certainly. Hope, a fragile flicker of it, but also an immense sadness, a wrenching sense of loss. This is goodbye to the fields, the mountains, the sea that sustained you in the worst of times, to the graves scattered across the land of those who didn't make it this far. The journey begins. The ship pitches and rolls on the open sea. Sickness spreads quickly through the crowded hold. The food rations, if provided at all, are meager and poor quality. Water is scarce and often brackish. The air below decks becomes foul, a breeding ground for disease. You learn to brace yourself against the ship's movements, to conserve your strength, to ignore the coughing, the groaning, the sounds of suffering all around you. Survival here is different. It's about enduring confinement, disease, and the relentless indifference of the ocean. The quirky tidbit you heard about passengers trying to grow potatoes in tubs on deck is not only wildly impractical, but now seems like a cruel, dark joke in this stinking hold. Who would have the energy, let alone the space or the potatoes? Days blur into a miserable, monotonous existence. The darkness, the smell, the constant motion of the sea. You think back to the taste of seaweed, the predictable rhythm of the coast. It was boring, yes, but it was the known. This is a different kind of boring. The boring of endless suffering. The tedious wait for the journey to end, trapped between a past you fled and a future you can only dimly imagine. Historians still argue whether the conditions on these ships were a deliberate cruelty, a reflection of capitalist indifference to human life, or simply an unavoidable consequence of attempting to transport such vast numbers of impoverished people across an ocean with limited resources and technology. For you, enduring the voyage, the debate feels abstract. What matters is getting through it. Each day is a victory against the sea, against disease, against despair. You sleep fitfully, lulled by the ship's movement, but never truly resting, the awareness of your precarious situation always just beneath the surface. You are leaving Ireland, leaving the famine behind, but carrying its scars, its memories, and the taste of salt and desperation with you across the vast, indifferent ocean. You are on the ship,